Welcome. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Priscilla Wald. Dr. Wald is the R. Florence Brinkley Distinguished Professor of English at Duke University, so not too far down from us, and holds degrees in English from Yale and Columbia Universities. As you saw in the announcement we sent out about today's talk, she is the author of Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, and has also written and edited book-length works on cultural anxiety, another very relevant concept, I think, to our current context, and also narrative form, as well as the history of the American novel. Dr. Wald's current work focuses on the intersection of law, literature, science, and medicine, and we'll be hearing about some of that today. Also, some of you may be familiar with her name from appearances on local news media. She's been giving numerous appearances in various platforms due to the relevance of her work to the current pandemic response. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wald.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. I don't think I need to tell this audience that a pandemic is a world-changing event. We're living through it. And although I've given talks on this topic for the past decade and a half, the past couple of weeks is the first time I've done this while sheltering at home in the midst of a pandemic. And it is a humbling and daunting experience to do so, really sobering. I began this work, I think, when I look back, motivated by having lived through another worldwide pandemic, and that, of course, is HIV. And the HIV pandemic was very different from COVID-19 in many ways. It took a long time to even realize there was a disease. It has a very long incubation period. So it was hard to identify. It was very mysterious. It was hard to identify what it was, how it was transmitted. It was unfortunately, tragically, almost universally fatal in those early years. And that's very different from COVID-19. At the same time, it didn't suddenly stop human interactions, our day-to-day interactions worldwide in the way COVID-19 has. Although, again, it was world-changing, and it certainly changed human interactions radically in some communities and populations. So each outbreak and each pandemic is unique, but there are certain conventions, and particularly in the storyline, among them. And I call these conventions, the storyline, the outbreak narrative, and it's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And the reason I think the outbreak narrative is important is, as sociolinguists, cognitive linguists, cognitive anthropologists, discourse analysts, and rhetoricians all tell us, the way we talk about something, the narratives, the vocabulary, the visual images, both register assumptions and beliefs we don't necessarily know we have, and analyzing them allows us to see them, but they also promote and spread in a, shall I say, contagious way, those beliefs. And the way we tell the story influences how we understand a problem. And that has consequences for treatment protocols, for survival and transmission rates, for medical outcomes, for geopolitics and economics. It has really broad consequences. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And obviously, COVID-19 is the backdrop for this talk, but we're not going to know the full story of COVID-19 until it's over, and it will be over, at least in some form, soon. I shouldn't say soon, sorry. It will be over at some point. And what I'm hoping is that if we think about the outbreak narrative and its conventions, it might help us better understand the experience that we're going through now. And it might help us to tell a different story once we're looking back at this experience. And, you know, the outbreak narrative is a very important story in many ways. It's very helpful. It's kind of like a technology. It allows epidemiologists and other medical professionals to identify an outbreak of a catastrophic communicable disease very quickly, and ideally work to identify the source and contain it and so forth. But it also has some conventions that I think are very problematic. And as I say, it affects treatment protocols, survival, transmission, et cetera. So I think it's very important to look at the outbreak narrative and how it works, what it is, what those conventions are. I'm going to begin by showing you the trailer from the 2011 film Contagion, which I think many of you have probably been watching or rewatching in recent days. Maybe some of you have been avoiding. So this is the trailer for that film.
It was a groundbreaking ceremony for a new factory.
Did she mention seeing anyone who was sick? Anyone on a plane, at the airport?
No, she said she was jet lagged.
The average person touches their face 3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doorknobs, water fountains, and each other.
Matt.
Mom?
No, go up to your room, honey.
So we have a virus with no treatment protocol and no vaccine at this time.
You had a seizure this morning, Beth.
She had a history of seizures,
No.
allergies.
As of last night, there were 32 cases.
Unfortunately, she did die.
Right. And he says, can I go talk to her?
Mr. Amoff, your wife is dead.
What are you talking about?
Okay.
What happened to her? What happened to her?
Is there any way someone could weaponize the bird flu? Is that what we're looking at?
Someone doesn't have to weaponize the bird flu. The birds are doing that.
Watch this. It's transmission, so we just need to know which direction.
On day 1, there were 2 people, and then 4, and then 16. In 3 months, it's 1 billion. That's where we're headed.
They're calling out the National Guard. They're moving the president underground.
People will panic.
Get away!
It will tip over.
The truth is being kept from the world.
Cook your samples, destroy everything.
Hello. I need you to get me the names of everyone who serviced this room. It's an emergency.
You can't panic now.
I know.
I'm gonna get you home.
I got people too, Dr. Cheever. We all do.
Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch anyone. Stay away from other people.
Get back in your car. We're not sick.
It's figuring us out faster than we're figuring it out.
It's mutated.
So the trailer, I think, tells you a lot about what this film is about, in case you haven't seen it. But the question that I want to start with, and what I think about for the outbreak narrative, is why is this story so appealing? If a story is paradigmatic, it's because people are really engaged by it. What is appealing about a catastrophic, a pandemic of a catastrophic communicable disease? People have described this story this film as a thriller, and it is indeed a medical thriller. It's also, as any outbreak story, as a detective narrative. It's a disaster narrative. It wasn't coincidental that it was released 2 days before the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 World Trade bombings. But I think there's also something very particular about an outbreak narrative that I think you can see even from the trailer, and that is that I think it focuses our nebulous anxieties about globalization, about social relations and human interactions in a globalizing, which also means shrinking, world. Gwyneth Paltrow is a wife and a mother, but she's also a high-power corporate executive. She's sent to the opposite side of the globe on business, that is Asia. She has, I think we're meant to see it as an exotic place with questionable food hygiene, and from the food she contracts this catastrophic illness and seeds several outbreaks that eventually become a worldwide pandemic of a flu that is multiple times worse than even what we're going through now. The outbreak narrative has tends to pathologize certain places, people, behaviors, populations. And in this case, I think, again, there's a stigmatizing of Asia as somehow dirty, unhygienic, and also of Gwyneth Paltrow, of a woman in this high-powered job who leaves her family and brings back this horrific disease. And she's further pathologized by, or criminalized even, on her way home. She very implausibly extends a layover in Chicago and has a quick liaison with a former paramour who's a politician. There's a sense of this being an illicit relationship even in the first place. And there's really no reason for that yet. Seeds an outbreak, but there are outbreaks all over the world at this point. So again, it's a kind of further stigmatizing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But it's also a classic outbreak in another way, and that is it has a mythic quality. There's a sense, first of all, it has to be to be an outbreak narrative, it has to be a catastrophic communicable disease. It wouldn't be a cold, how a cold is spreading. It really has to be species threatening, really apocalyptic. And there's a kind of mythic struggle between the forces of science and medicine, which are humanity at its most progressive, and the kind of anthropomorphized nature in the microbe, the animated forces of nature. There's an apocalyptic battle over the fate of humanity. And I call it mythic, partly that's a characteristic of myth, but also because there's a sense at the end of it of a kind of rejuvenation, a reaffirmation of humanity, that we're on the right track. We have a fresh start. We're rejuvenated. We will triumph over these dangerous forces. So while the pandemic is catastrophic, it's also ultimately contained. And that's where the reaffirmation comes from. And there's one other element, which is that there's also an inherent fascination with contagion. And you can see it in a more mundane form in a global health textbook, or called The Politics of Global Health, United by Contagion. And in the first paragraph, we learn that health is the ultimate unifying issue for humankind. The world is becoming an ever smaller place, and microbes that cause devastating diseases do not stop for border guards. I find it very interesting to think of how we're united by contagion, that health, specifically contagion, they're synonymous here, is the ultimate unifying issue for humankind. And that has two reasons. On the one hand, we're united by these issues because we are all susceptible. As the slogan that we've seen popping up in our neighborhoods tell us, we are all in this together. So we're all susceptible in the same ways. I'm going to show that's not quite true, but that's the logic here. But we're also all susceptible because we are, because what contagion shows us is how we are passing these diseases among each other, how we have intimate contacts with people we don't even know we're in contact with. We've maybe passed on a subway, or we've touched the same doorknob in close proximity. And so there's this sense of contagion being really an analog for what it means to be human, that on the one hand, we are social beings, we need each other, and on the other hand, we're a danger to each other. This paragraph continues, more and more, we are coming to understand that people with diseases located anywhere from down the street to the other side of the globe have important and varied impacts on our well-being. Health has become more than a medical issue. It is also a developmental issue, a commercial issue, a humanitarian issue, and a security issue. So this is not just a question of, this is not just a medical problem, it's a much broader social and human problem. So, once again, here's that slogan, we are all in this together. This is from my neighborhood. And again, the analog that I'm talking about, this kind of ambiguity of what exactly it means that we're all in this together, I think is really represented nicely on the Duke sign on the right of your screen. We're in this together, keep your distance. So it's a sense of community, but we are also danger. We represent dangers to each other. And that's the kind of paradox I want to explore as we move on. So I'm going to turn now to the outbreak narrative itself. And I have two 2 points of reference I want to begin with. And one is something that I wish more people knew about, and that is a conference that was held at Alma-Ata in the former Soviet Union in September of 1978. And it was sponsored by the World Health Organization and UNICEF. And as you see on your screen, there were delegates from 134 nations and 67 UN organizations. It was inspired by programs in the Global South, such as the Barefoot Doctors program in China. And it affirmed the UN definition of health as something that was more than disease, but a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and a fundamental human right. Everyone was entitled to this state of well-being. And that included not just absence of disease, it included proper shelter, it included a reasonable income, it included access to nutritious food, clean water, proper clothing. And the signatories of this commitment agreed to work for universal access to primary health care by the year 2000. Obviously, we are far from this. I'm going to return to this at the end of this talk as a way of thinking about how we might retell the story of the outbreak narrative in a more just and a more socially and globally responsible way. The other point of reference is really the beginning of the thing I identify as the outbreak narrative. And that was a 1989 conference in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Rockefeller University, and the Fogarty International Center, and organized by Joshua Lederberg. And this was at the end of the decade when HIV had made its rounds around the globe. And it came out of a sense of surprise, actually, because in the 1970s, people like Lederberg, who's a well-known epidemiologist and infectious disease specialist, and what's called a virus hunter, people like Lederberg were really saying that communicable disease was going to be a problem in the past. It was going to be a chronic problem, but not a major threat to humanity. And that was in the late 70s after the eradication of naturally occurring smallpox. And the CDC, which had been founded to address communicable disease, began to look at other kinds of epidemics like obesity, drug abuse, that sort of thing, rather than communicable disease, because really this was not going to be a problem. But even while they were expressing that sanguinity, there were these new horrific diseases that were emerging in remote villages around the world. And these were diseases like Ebola, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever, Marburg, things that were really catastrophic communicable diseases. But because they were so devastating, they didn't travel very far. But all of a sudden, in the 80s, we had HIV that did break out, and we had more threats from these smaller outbreaks. And this group got together, and it was, they realized they labeled this all part of one phenomenon that they called disease emergence. And they said, this can't just be a problem for medical science and epidemiology. This was a much bigger problem. It was a consequence of globalization and development patterns. The world was expanding, and the population was, or rather the population was expanding and moving into new habitations where they were encountering microbes to which there was no immunity. They were, human beings were what's called immunologically naive. At the same time, the globe was shrinking and people were more and more interconnected. And so these horrific diseases could more easily break out of these remote locations, get into cities, and travel very quickly around the world. And this was the beginning of what I call the outbreak narrative. So what happened was, first of all, there was a number of publications. The two that you see in the center were collections from people who had attended the conference. And the ones to the left and right of them were scientific journalism that came out of this, and then eventually it got into popular culture. So what I track is how conventions that are both visual and verbal, textual, emerge from science and get into scientific journalism, then the mainstream media, and eventually popular fiction and film. And they form these conventions that I'm about to identify for you that I call the outbreak narrative. And the reason this is so important is that the outbreak narrative, as it eventually got told, as you will see, as I'll suggest, actually did the opposite of what the 1989 convention intended. The convention really wanted this message to get out that we were going to have to change our broad development practices, but also our day-to-day practices and behaviors, that this really involved a new way of thinking of how to be in the world. And it was like different from, but also I think intersected with the Alma-Ata narrative, which is that we all have a social responsibility. So if we're going to prevent these problems, if we're going to live more responsibly in the world, we really couldn't just rely on scientific medicine to change this kind of problem. We had to change our behaviors. The outbreak narrative, as I suggested to you, tells the opposite story. Ultimately, it is epidemiology and scientific medicine alone that contain these problems. And I will suggest some of the reasons this is problematic. So I have my second and final film clip, and this is the opening scene of the 1995 Wolfgang Petersen film, Outbreak, which really put this vocabulary and a lot of these images into popular circulation, along with Richard Preston's Hot Zone. So I'm going to show you this clip. And what you'll see at the opening is something that's called a bird's eye view and an establishing shot. And you'll see that we're going to start in the treetops. We're going to go slowly down into a place. And many outbreak narratives start with this. And what they're doing is suggesting to us that there is something, that this place looks very peaceful, but there's something really dangerous and even pathological about this place.
Men wounded in battle we can deal with. But this strange disease. 30 men dead yesterday. 18 the day before. We need supplies. Plasma, penicillin.
I'll get you everything you need, Doctor.
You're Americans. Please, get me out of this shithole.
Hey, buddy, that's what we're here for. We're gonna take you home. But first, we're gonna take a little blood sample, all right?
I'm gonna die, right?
No, you're not gonna die.
Tell my girl I love her.
You're not gonna tell her. You're gonna tell her yourself, all right?
The soldiers inside are in the early stages of the disease. By tomorrow night, they will look like this.
Mother of God. I'll authorize an immediate airdrop, Doctor. It's even worse than I thought. Get the plane here by 1900 hours.
Well, shouldn't we at least...
Get the plane, Billy.
So I showed this clip because I think it really encapsulates a number of the conventions that I want to outline for you today. And I mentioned initially the establishing shot. There is always a geography of disease in the outbreak narrative. And the outbreak narrative that I'm talking about, the one I studied, is Anglo-American. So it's the US and England. And it always comes from the global south. The disease comes from the global south to the global north, which is not historically accurate, but that's how this story is told. Expertise moves in the other direction. I think this is an interesting image of expertise. So you saw Donald Sutherland and Morgan Freeman walking out with the Zairian doctor. And he says, men in the first stages of the disease, the early stages look like this. After 24, 48 hours, they look like this. And he begins to open the tarp, and you expect to see something gruesome. The camera does a 180, and we're looking at it through the visor of Donald Sutherland, as though we're going to see through his eyes. He's got the expertise. He's going to decide what the problem is and how best to deal with it. And the film somewhat problematizes this. He turns out not to be very good at this, but it shifts to Dustin Hoffman. Nonetheless, right, the expertise comes from the global north to the global south. Again, not historically accurate, but that's the story. It's also a story about interdependence and the threat that a small, isolated place poses to the rest of the world, the need for containment, and a sense of who is expendable and who is not. So these people in a mercenary camp in Zaire are expendable. The Africans, the Zairians who are at war, are expendable. 20 years later, when this gets into actually a small California town, and Donald Sutherland literally wants to nuke it, people say, but you can't do that. There are people living there. And he says, well, casualties of war. Same thing he says to Morgan Freeman. And the response is, but these are Americans, sir. So who's expendable? Who is not? Who's at fault for the problem? Who is not? I'm now going to talk to you just very quickly. I'm going to show you how these conventions, what they are, and how they move from the science into the mainstream media and eventually into popular fiction and film. But I want to say from the outset that I have great respect for a lot of these journalists and the scientists. And I'm not saying, the fact that the vocabulary is undermining the message that they're trying to portray is no comment on their skill. I find all the time myself that I'm constantly using language and images, metaphors, visual images that have implications I haven't thought through. This is true of all of us. So, the formation of the outbreak narrative, I'm not accusing them of being irresponsible. I'm saying this is how analyzing this is how we can see how all of us think about problems without realizing it. And set up a narrative that's different from the narrative that we want to convey. So Richard Krauss, who was one of the people who attended the 1989 conference, tells us that, like science, emerging viruses know no country. There are no barriers to prevent their migration across international boundaries or around the 24 time zones. So this is one of the big conventions, right, of the outbreak narrative. These are apocalyptic problems. We have a lot of interdependence, and we have to really think about our borders. Richard Preston picks this up in the Hot Zone, which a lot of people call a novel. It is not a novel. It's sensational journalism. But again, you can see how these conventions begin to emerge. A hot virus in the rainforest lives within a 24-hour plane flight from every city on Earth. All of the Earth's cities are connected by a web of airline routes. The web is a network. Once a virus hits the net, it can shoot anywhere in a day: Paris, Tokyo, New York, LA, wherever planes fly. And again, this is accurate, but it's also, as you see, becoming sensational. It's a convention that is forming. Laurie Garrett, whose book Coming Plague is very important, I highly recommend it, talks about how the Andromeda strain nearly surfaced in Africa in the form of Ebola virus. Megacities were arising in the developing world, creating niches from which virtually anything might arise. Rainforests were being destroyed, forcing disease-carrying animals and insects into areas of human habitation, and raising the very real possibility that lethal, mysterious microbes would, for the first time, infect humanity on a large scale and imperil the survival of the human race. Again, very important analysis. She's talking about how this is a problem of development, this is a climate problem, an environmental problem. But again, I want to point to her language. She uses the Andromeda strain, as a lot of the scientists do in the 90s in the narrative or the text I was looking at. And of course, the metaphor comes from Michael Crichton's 1969 novel and the film from the early 70s. And it, again, very commonly used. One of the things I noticed, it was always used in the US texts for Africa, in the British texts, also often East Asia. It was never used for England or the US. And I find that particularly interesting because the actual novel is set in the US Southwest, where in the mid-90s there was an outbreak of hantavirus, which is one of these devastating illnesses, but nobody used the Andromeda strain for that. So again, certain places are highly pathologized, and that can create problems that I will go into. Also, it was creating niches from which virtually anything might arise, as though there's something really almost science fictional about these spaces. Another convention is the animating and often anthropomorphizing of the microbe. You might have heard the comparison of COVID-19 to a war, which again has certain in certain ways can be very helpful for us to think about, particularly since there are wartime measures a president can take that could be helping us right now. But the notion of microbial warfare, which is a metaphor I see all the time in the documents that came out of the 1989 convention, is problematic given the, again, analysis they want us to hear, which is human beings are responsible for these problems, not microbes. And to call it microbial warfare is to have a kind of enemy that is doing this to us rather than something we are doing ourselves. So Joshua Lederberg talks about how difficult it is for human beings to accommodate to the reality that nature is far from benign. At least it has no special sentiment for the welfare of the human versus other species. The survival of the human species is not a preordained evolutionary program. We don't want to think about nature as indifferent. We want an enemy we can somehow animate, anthropomorphize, envision, and then go to war with it, rather than, again, think about what we're doing and how to change our practices. And look at how this becomes conventional. Richard Krauss, again, one of the participants in the 1989 conference, microbes are not idle bystanders waiting for new opportunities offered by human mobility, ignorance, or neglect. Microbes possess remarkable genetic versatility, enabling them to develop new pathogenic vigor, escape population immunity by acquiring new antigens, and to develop antibiotic resistance. They are more than simple opportunists. They have also been great innovators. To the bottom of the page, viruses are, and this is Richard Preston, viruses are molecular sharks, emotive without a mind, compact, hard, logical, totally selfish. The virus is dedicated to making copies of itself, which it can do on occasion with radiant speed. The prime directive is to replicate. The other problem with this, again, is the kind of stigmatizing that we see, we've been seeing in COVID-19, the anti-Asian biases and violence. And Barbara Culleton, also like Laurie Garrett, a very fine science journalist, nonetheless, look at her metaphor and how she describes Sol virus as an unwelcome immigrant, a cousin of Asian hantavirus, which causes hemorrhagic fever. It's very easy to take that animated microbe and embody it in a human being. So on the one hand, we're at war with the microbes, but then suddenly we're at war with the people that we've identified as somehow responsible for or carrying this disease. And again, we've seen the very negative consequences ourselves in COVID-19. At the bottom of the page, since 9/11, terrorists have been, or bioterrorists have been a classic way of thinking about microbes. So Madeline Drexler, also a very fine science journalist, describes secret agents, microbes as, or viruses as, secret agents that shadow ecological change everywhere, nature's undercover operatives hijacking the cell's metabolic machinery, a wireless communication system enabling microbes to coordinate their activities. And again, the problem with this is we see it a lot. Whenever there's an outbreak, there's very quick conspiracy theories about how this is bioterror. And if we're too quick to have to jump to conclusions like that, it might waste valuable time in identifying where the outbreak really came from, and also foster the kind of biases and stigmas I've been talking about. It's a very quick jump from animating microbes to seeing them almost as supernatural. There's a kind of microbial mystique. Preston describes one of the scientists involved in identifying the Ebola virus in Hot Zone as looking into the electron microscope and seeing white cobras tangled among themselves like the hair of Medusa. They were the face of nature herself, the obscene goddess revealed naked. This life form thing was breathtakingly beautiful. As he stared at it, he found himself being pulled out of the human world into a world where moral boundaries blur and finally dissolve completely. He was lost in wonder and admiration, even though he knew that he was the prey. And once you've animated the microbe, and here's the problem with that, and made it sort of mystical, almost supernatural, they very quickly become representative of an incarnated Earth. And you can see this most clearly in the fiction, which I'll get to in a moment. But Carl Johnson, again, one of the participants in the 1989 conference, describing the Earth as, in fact, a progressively immunocompromised ecosystem. Or Preston, in the journalistic Hot Zone, describes the biosphere as maybe not liking the idea of 5 billion humans, or perhaps the human species is just so much meat that cannot defend itself against a life form that might want to consume it. The Earth's immune system, so to speak, has recognized the presence of the human species and is starting to kick in. And I see this constantly in both the science and the journalism. And the problem with it, I think, is really captured very well in the fiction and film. And the reason I find it so important to study popular culture is fiction and film acts almost like a magnifying glass. So they take a metaphor like microbial warfare. And, when I give talks to scientists, I say, here's this metaphor, microbial warfare. It really tells you something about how you're thinking about this problem, even though you're trying to make a very different argument. And they'll say, it's just a metaphor. Don't make such a mountain out of a molehill. But one of the things that the popular culture does is it allows us, they take that kind of metaphor and they blow it up into a kind of extended scenario, into a plot line. And it's like taking a magnifying glass and looking at something very tiny. You get to see much more clearly what it is and what the problem with these metaphors and these narratives are. So Chuck Hogan in the novel Blood Artists, which is just a perfect example. He hits every convention of the outbreak narrative. And he describes that it's a story about two CDC epidemiologists who are tracking an environmentalist. And one of the problems is a lot of these novels have environmentalists as bad guys and deliberately seeding these outbreaks to get rid of the human virus. So they describe this person who gets infected and becomes a kind of hybrid virus human being. The virus begins to take him over. And you don't know where the environmentalist ends and the virus begins. So they're tracking this guy they call Patient Zero, who's seeding outbreaks all over the world in order to rid the Earth of the human virus. And Hogan writes, the threat of a mutant virus, gifted with human intellect and cunning, posed hazards exceeding Marek's worst imaginings. He's one of the researchers, one of the epidemiologists. But all he envisioned was its one great advantage. Epidemic control had never been simpler. Zero was like a tumor Marek could go in and surgically remove. So you see how this narrative that has become so conventional is giving us the message that is exactly the opposite of the one that the 1989 conference wanted to circulate. It's telling us, don't worry, scientific medicine and epidemiology will solve these problems. We don't have to change our behaviors. And again, if you're in the middle of an outbreak, absolutely. Scientific medicine, epidemiology, vaccines, drugs, quarantine, these are the things we absolutely need and want. But when we step back, when the pandemic has been contained and we step back and we think about how we can prevent something like this happening again, we want to tell a story at a very different scale. But before I get there, let me just quickly show you one more example of the outbreak narrative and how, I've shown you the exaggerated form in popular fiction and film, but here's a more sedate journalistic one. This is what it looks like. So this is from a May 5th, 2003 special issue dedicated to the SARS pandemic while it was going on. So May 5th, 2003. These photographs were on a facing pages and they were conjoined by the caption that I've printed above. Fear of SARS prompts a Lufthansa crew to wear masks in the Hong Kong airport. The virus may have been born on a farm like the one above in Guangzhou, China, where animals and people live close together. And here's the narrative that goes with it. The novel coronavirus that causes the syndrome emerged from Guangdong, the same Chinese province that delivers new flu viruses to the world most years. Pigs, ducks, chickens, and people live cheek by jowl on the district's primitive farms, exchanging flu and cold germs so rapidly that a single pig can easily incubate human and avian viruses simultaneously. The dual infections can generate hybrids that escape antibodies aimed at the originals, setting off a whole new chain of human infection. The clincher is that these farms sit just a few miles from Guangzhou, a teeming city that mixes people, animals, and microbes from the countryside with travelers from around the world. You could hardly design a better system for turning small outbreaks into big ones. So let's go back and look at this narrative. So, outbreak narrative, it begins in the global south and it's primitive, and the problem is here are these people who are living in this very unhygienic way, cheek by jowl with their animals, and the primitive is juxtaposed with the modern, so it gets out into the city and into the airport, and since we are a shrinking world and interconnected, this outbreak quickly becomes a pandemic and it's threatening everybody. It is ultimately contained by the expertise, the narrative talks about this, in the global north, in scientific medicine and epidemiology that contains it and allows us to move on as we were. And so what's wrong with this picture? First of all, this is not an image of primitive people who don't know better than to live in these unhygienic ways with their animals. It's a picture of poverty where people live in the spaces that they can afford. And if we're going to fix the problem, if we see this as a problem, we need to address that problem by allowing people to live in bigger spaces, to live hygienically because they have enough space in which to live and to make to have a livelihood. It is not a problem that begins in the global south. Poverty is a socioeconomic problem worldwide, right? This is not caused by the global south, but by our systems, our interconnected systems. And we need to change those practices and behaviors and not just rely on scientific medicine. So again, this is how the problem looks there. I told you that near the end of the talk, and I am near the end of the talk, I would return to Alma-Ata. So at the 30th anniversary of Alma-Ata, Margaret Chan, who was the director of the World Health Organization, made the theme for the year Return to Alma-Ata. And in the WHO's World Health Report, published in 2008, which was entitled Primary Healthcare Now More Than Ever, she said those goals of Alma-Ata were really important. Why aren't we doing them? And she said, why are we not addressing global poverty first and foremost as a humanitarian issue, right? As a basic human right, everybody's entitled to a decent standard of living, defined as primary health. but also as a medical issue, because there is no better vector for turning an outbreak into a pandemic than global poverty. And finally, it's economically wise. So we say something like global poverty, it's very abstract, it sounds huge, it sounds like something we can't address. But her point is the estimated cost of a pandemic, and these figures are very much in flux. So I've included 3 sites where you can go and look at how these figures, these economic figures are changing, where they are now. But the estimated cost of a pandemic, World Bank projections, even before COVID-19, was that a pandemic like COVID-19, a catastrophic flu, would cost upwards of $3 trillion US dollars, up to 4.8% of the global GDP. And even a moderately virulent flu pandemic would be roughly 2.2% of the GDP. The cost, by contrast, of permanent infrastructural changes worldwide and then annually keeping up preparedness would be less than 1% of the cost of a response. And that translates into less than 1% US dollars per person. So, to conclude, how will we, or should we, I hope we will tell the story of COVID-19 when it's over, when it's at least contained? Do we want to tell it as a story of medical science versus enemy microbes doing mythic battle for the fate of humanity? Or do we want to tell it as a story of human beings acknowledging social responsibility for the world in which we all live? While we are mid-pandemic, of course it's going to be a story of crisis and survival, and I am deeply grateful to the medical professionals, the epidemiologists, and all of the other people who are working to not only keep us safe, but keep us fed, keep us comfortable in our homes. And of course, the emphasis is going to be, as I said earlier, on vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and quarantine. But when we look back, we need to widen the scale and tell this as a much bigger story of how, or ask, think about how we want to live more responsibly and equitably in a global world. Because as Paul Farmer says, diseases themselves make a preferential option for the poor. And that is both in every way, not just a problem for the poor, but for all of us to address. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Wald. I wish we could clap. I was noticing there's a little applause button, but I'm not quite sure how to use it here. So anyone who wants to ask a question, feel free to submit a chat. And in the meantime, while you're thinking about your questions, I was just curious myself if you could talk a little bit about what got you into this work in the first place. I think some of the thoughts you raised have certainly crossed my mind. I remember when the Outbreak movie came out and just kind of marveling about some of the things that were included in it. But I'm just curious how all these pieces came together for you.
Yeah, it was very serendipitous. So I had just finished my first book, which came out in 1995. And so I had some time to engage in some pop culture that I had been missing, going to movies and reading books. And in my first book, I had written a little bit about medicalized nativism, which is a term that Alan Kraut coined and writes about in a book called Silent Travelers, which I highly recommend. And what he talks about is the way that the medical exam and so forth for immigrants at the turn of the 20th century was used by people who were strong nativists who wanted to prevent immigration by saying, all of you progressives who want to open our borders, you're actually threatening the health of our population. These people bring diseases. And I had gotten particularly interested in the story of Mary Mallon, an Irish cook who's better known as Typhoid Mary. And so I was very interested. I was doing some research on that. I went to Outbreak and I thought, there's a lot about this that really feels familiar from the Typhoid Mary story. And at the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and I don't think this was conscious in my mind, but I had, of course, lived through with a lot of very close friends being HIV positive, some of them dying early on, all of them dying from HIV. And I was in New York in 1980 and through the 80s, and I had really watched that unfold, and the fear that we all felt for in our populations. And I remembered the story of patient zero also. So all of these things started to come together, and I began to ask myself, what's going on with this? And I kind of worked on the book for a while, put it aside. But when the SARS outbreak happened and the pandemic happened, I was really struck by how often I kept hearing patient zero and Typhoid Mary mentioned. And it brought me back to the work. And I said, I got to write this book. Something's going on here. So it was those different elements, and it was over a very long period of time. But the actual writing I really dove into in 2003 with the SARS pandemic.
Sure, and just a quick follow-up, and then I do have a question from an audience member. Sorry for hogging the mic here. But do you see any improvement in the past 10 years in the way societies respond, or the language, care around language that gets used, or is it just as bad as it was 10 years ago, let alone 40 years ago? I mean, I would just be curious about your thoughts about that.
I would say both and. So we heard our president refer to Chinese flu, Wuhan flu, Kung flu. You know, we're people, Asians are getting beaten up in the streets and discriminated against broadly. I mean, just horrible stuff that we continue to see. And I continue to see a lot of the same kinds of analysis. But what's hopeful about it is I'm seeing more and more journalists write about the social justice issues, talk about the need to think about poverty and to think about the way we're living in the world and to think very differently about it, and that this is not, this problem doesn't begin with the outbreak, but begins with a much broader framework. So I am seeing that analysis come out in the mainstream media, and even mentioned in popular fiction and film. And I do see people some journalists pushing back on the stigmatizing the carriers, the patient zeros, the Typhoid Marys. So there's more awareness of these conventions and of pushing back against them than I saw 10 years ago.
Sure, thank you. So I'll just go on to some questions from the audience. Is it true that African Americans are dying at a higher rate from COVID-19 in the US than other demographics?
Yes,
and
it
why
is.
Might that be?
It absolutely is. And I think the term that I really like is structural violence. And I want to go back actually even to the term that inspired structural violence, which is from Stokely Carmichael, the term institutional racism. And Stokely Carmichael made the point in 1969 that when 5 Black young girls are blown up in a church, which had just happened in Birmingham, Alabama, the whole world decries the racism of that. He said that's explicit racism. But he says when 500 Black babies die to every one white baby in that same city every year, or I don't remember the amount of time, but in Birmingham, Alabama, he said that's institutional racism. That's something that our institutions are perpetuating. And they're keeping certain populations in poverty. They don't have access to the same kind of healthcare and opportunities. And it's a vicious cycle that is not caused by those populations, but by the institutions. And then Johan Galtung, who was a Norwegian statistician and peace activist, based on Carmichael's work, coined the term structural violence. And he said these inequities are embedded in the structures of our society. And we can see them if we look at the statistics, that certain populations are much more excluded from the privileges of society and forced to live in poverty. And so this is the kind of thing that we see borne out in racialized populations in the US and worldwide. And it's crises like these expose the brokenness of our system. And that's one very vivid and very horrifying example of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this next question kind of continues on this theme. I'll just read it to you. It's a little bit long. Dr. Wald makes it clear with COVID-19 that we need to, at some point, switch from a survival crisis narrative to one of social change. How and through what means can we make this switch? In other words, how do we prevent the public, the media, and politicians from latching onto the primary narrative and not moving on to a narrative of social change?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a great answer. My answer is through education, through, I teach this material. I hope that my students go on to influence other people. Some of them, I hope, will become journalists or epidemiologists and really push this story in every facet that they can. That's a very small population, but more and more people writing about it. And I think getting out there with op-eds, getting out there with publications, getting out there with talking to journalists. I've been doing a lot of interviews with journalists, and I've been trying to get this into sound bites so that it's communicable. Interesting choice of word there, my metaphor. But it's a slow process, but the more people that are talking about it and pushing it and getting the message out there, the more we can start to do this. And it happens in many different facets of society. But as I said, I'm optimistic because I see more journalists doing this kind of analysis. So we need more books about it. We need more documentaries about it. Everything, social media, every way we can communicate.
Absolutely. And I have a question here about the war metaphor you raised. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And the question is simply, how do you feel about the war metaphor being used?
So as I said, it's mixed. And, just like the outbreak narrative is mixed. And I want to be very clear. I don't think every aspect of the outbreak narrative is a problem. There are the features that I talked about, that I want us to think about. But the outbreak narrative, as I said in the talk, is also a technology that allows epidemiologists to identify a problem quickly and act on it. So I don't want to do away with our metaphors. The war metaphor can be very useful if, when people have to think about living in austerity or making sacrifices for others or putting their lives on the line, or, as I said, having the president tap into some of the things in the, that are made possible by wartime, kind of wartime provisions that he could be accessing now and isn't. But the notion of microbial warfare that I identified as problematic is something that says the problem is coming from a conscious, logical microbe that has declared war on us, and what we need to do is fight back. So that's the crisis and survival thing, when in fact, if the real purpose of the 1989 conference was to get out a different way of thinking about this, that we need to not just rely on the crisis when it happens and having scientific medicine, epidemiology, public health, et cetera, deal with it, but that we need to change our daily practices and need to see ourselves as responsible, right? We are creating the environmental conditions that allow these outbreaks to happen and allow them to become pandemics. Our development practices, where we're settling, how we behave when we settle there, how we perpetuate global poverty as a world, right? Our economic systems are perpetuating global poverty and keeping some people in that status at the expense of others who are more privileged. The other way around. Some are privileged at the expense of those who are have-nots. All of those things are the ways in which we are perpetuating this problem. Human beings are perpetuating this problem. Climate change, all of it. And microbial warfare does not convey that idea that we are responsible. It conveys the exact opposite. You heard it in the, I can go back there, the Preston quotation. They're not idle bystanders. They're more simple and that's the science. They're more than simple opportunists. They're great innovators. And Preston calls them logical, selfish, dedicated to replicate, as though the microbes really do have a mind of their own. And I think, that's the metaphor we don't want to be thinking about. That's the thing that keeps us from thinking about our own responsibility.
All right, well, I have 2 more questions here, and I am conscious of time.
If anybody doesn't get a question answered, please feel free to email me at pwald@duke.edu.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So this next question, it might be more of a sciencey question, but the participant is asking, what is the tipping point for returning to normalcy, in your opinion? I've heard until we hit herd immunity or have a working vaccine, we're at the same risk of a spike in cases that we have now. Is this the case? And if so, what is the tipping point?
I mean, I don't know in terms of statistics or numbers, but, and I want to be very clear. I'm an English professor. I'm not an expert in global health. You guys are, a lot of you in the audience. And so I probably should throw that question back to Catherine. Personally, I would say vaccine. And a vaccine helps to create herd immunity. And I don't know, this is beyond my expertise, I'm afraid to say.
Sure.
Catherine, do you have an answer to that?
I would just add that I think the interesting thing buried in that question is how it relates to your thesis here, right? About what is normal. There's I think a very natural urge to say, I can't wait to return to my life as normal, right? But in a certain way, you're asking us to redefine that, right? And kind of own these problems that are far too easy for many of us that sit in positions of privilege or relative privilege to ignore and forget about when they're not forcing us to stay at home and have web talks instead of face-to-face talks. So, I mean, I think the thing that I would love to highlight in that is just your question that you had on the last slide, right? About like, what story are we going to tell? What can we do to perhaps change what normal means? There has been a lot of media about this changes everything, right? I've seen lots of headlines that say things like that. And the question I keep struggling with is, okay, so what can I do to make a meaningful change for me that aligns with my core beliefs, right? So I don't know if you have key takeaways on that topic besides just, the whole talk here, right? But that's kind of what strikes me in that question.
I mean, thank you for that, because that was a way better answer than I had. And that's exactly right. I mean, I don't want us to return to normal. I mean, I want us to return to being able to touch each other and hug each other and be with each other and not be scared and, and not have, a third of our population unemployed and a future that none of us understands where it's going to be. I mean, that's what I was thinking in terms of normal, but that's an example of my not even thinking about my own metaphors or how I'm thinking about normal, because yes, you're right, Catherine, the whole point of my talk is we shouldn't return to normal. We have to think about, and we're not going to in those ways, but we should be thinking about how we can live differently in our world. And one of the things that has been interesting in this whole experience is without people circulating, the environment is one of the beneficiaries, right? Which means we're all beneficiaries. And we should, maybe this, my hope for a silver lining out of this horrific experience is that people will say, and this answers my other question, we do need to think differently about this. We can't wait for a crisis. We need to practice better ways of living in the world. We need to think more responsibly. We need to, those of us who are privileged, I count myself, need to think about what that privilege entails and what I can, how I can change my very privileged behavior to be more economically and ecologically responsible, for example. So how can we live more justly in the world? And what will that entail? What sacrifices, and they're not sacrifices, they're changes, can those of us who are privileged to do so make in our lives that will help the world to be more just and where we can all live more responsibly? So yes, I don't want us to return to normal. Thank you for that, Catherine.
I have one last question here, which you touched on a little bit, but I'll just read it from the student, which is, while China is in the global South community, China has emerged recently as a major geopolitical challenger to the US Western liberal international order of authority. Have you observed any differences in narratives regarding the COVID-19 outbreak, given the different political standing of China today compared to 2003, or outbreaks originating from other communities in the global South?
That's a great question. These have all been fabulous questions, so I thank you for them, really. And that's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm actually surprised, and I could be totally wrong on this, and maybe someone will write something really interesting and enlighten me. But I have been very surprised at how similar the narrative about China is, given that, because I did expect something different. Global South and Global North are changing radically as our economic systems are changing. But I think the stigmatizing has lagged behind. And one of the good examples, I mean, again, China flu, Kung flu, Wuhan flu, the horrible things that have been said, but also the representations of the wet markets, which are not all one thing. And people don't understand that. I have not seen very much on that topic. People are saying, oh, we've got to close down the wet markets, and oh, those practices over there that are, irresponsible and whatever. People don't understand that wet markets, which exist in the US too, are very different, are not all one thing. And they are outdoor grocery stores, outdoor butchers, et cetera, which again, you can see in lots of places. Some of them are very well regulated, some of them are not. That's certainly true in US food production as well. So this idea that there's some kind of primitive practice, I'm not saying that we shouldn't regulate food production everywhere. That's again, one of the things that should come out of this worldwide is we should be thinking about food production. We should be thinking about our prison practices, prison reform. I mean, all of these things. But wet markets, I think, are a good example of how we are still using the same, primitivizing metaphors, even though the status of China is very different from what it was in 2003. So yeah, thank you for the question.
And just as a quick follow-up that came in and is related, and then we'll wrap it up because I know we're going over our time. Can you talk a little bit about this terminology of the China virus or Wuhan virus? Why that might be wrong? Why is it wrong to associate it with a particular geography, and clarify some of those concepts?
I mean, this goes back to like medieval times when, there would be like an outbreak, a pandemic of something, and it would be called the French disease by the British and the British disease by the French, or whatever, those aren't medieval terms, but, there is a quality in every crisis narrative that is definitely there in the outbreak narrative, which is us theming, right? And again, this is an opportunity where we can see how we're all one globe, or we can reinforce our borders. Think about how Trump wanted to close the Mexican border, even though there were far more COVID-19 cases in the US than in Mexico at the time. And so all of these biases get exacerbated. And when you name a virus biolocation, you are exacerbating the us, them, and you're setting certain people and populations up for the bias that we saw. So for example, when Barbara Culleton calls Seoul virus an immigrant, right? I mean, calls Hantan virus an immigrant from Seoul, or Seoul virus, she's setting it up so that if someone comes up, that every Korean somehow becomes a carrier. And I'll give you an example. During the SARS pandemic, a friend of mine refused to go to her usual florist that she'd been going to in Durham, North Carolina for 20 years because the woman was Chinese and SARS was in China. And I said, but that makes no sense. She's been living in the US for decades. Why would she have that virus? And she said, well, I mean, trying to make sense of it, she may have relatives visiting her. well, anyone, I mean, so the kinds of biases that we see come from the way that are exacerbated by, let's say, our naming practices.
Thank you. All right, well, in the absence of more questions and in the interest of time, I think we'll call it a day. So thank you all for submitting questions. Thank you, Dr. Wald, for joining us today. I wanted to reiterate again that Elon is recording this, and so there will be a link available on the website sooner or later if you want to go back and review any of the content for today. And just want to thank you once again, Priscilla, for joining us. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for the great questions.
Virtual clap.